we're now going to be joined virtually by Dr. Ross Koningstein. So Ross has a PhD from Stanford and is the Director Emeritus of Google and has worked on renewable energy, advanced nuclear energy R&D, and carbon-aware data centres. Ross will share with us a case study titled A Discovery That Nuclear Was Nonpartisan. Wouldn't that be amazing? Oh my God. So Ross.
Okay, hi, I'm Ross. I'm so happy to be present here at your event, even if it's virtual. I wanted to talk a bit about the discovery that nuclear was nonpartisan here in the United States. I know that when you talk about nuclear energy to people, a lot of people will have very different and occasionally strong opinions on it. And certainly here in the US, environmental groups have also had very strong and often negative opinions of it. And one might think that that could actually really counter getting anything done at the level of the government. But it turned out that that was not the case. So just a little backstory on myself. I grew up in Ontario, Canada, where there was an extensive build out of nuclear plants in the 1970s. I guess that dates me. We had school trips to Chalk River Labs, which was about 2 hours upriver from where I lived. And I even got to hold a can-do fuel rod in my hands and tour the research reactor there. As these reactors were rolling out, one of the major noticeable things actually was that acid rain wasn't damaging the limestone buildings in Ottawa, the capital city, anymore. And that was because a lot less coal was being burned. A few years later, as a kid, I lived in Paris with my family. My dad had a sabbatical year. And that was an interesting time because the oil crisis was fresh on everybody's mind. And I don't know how many people know that back then, some of France's electric generation was actually from imported fuel. And that was facing a potential embargo. So, France was looking at a potential shutdown of a chunk of their electric grid based on political events. This obviously created action in France, and they built out a significant nuclear power fleet. And they have cheaper, cleaner electricity than their neighbors, and that's pretty impressive. When I started working at Google, I obviously worked on a number of things before I got into energy. That didn't happen until over 10 years after I joined. But we looked at renewable energy for many years. And when we wound down that effort, a colleague and I published an article on what it would really take to reverse climate change. And one of the questions we posed in the article is, why is it that we see so little innovation in energy? Because that's one of the things that's basically a problem. And if you draw this pie diagram here on the left, that tiny slice that's highlighted is the amount of money that the energy industry puts into new technologies that could compete with existing technologies. And if you look at the far right, you can see a pie slice that is really a more balanced approach to being in an evolving industry that evolves new and improved products and new technologies. And so the way that, one versus the other, obviously a whole bunch of R&D needed to go into the energy market, particularly in nuclear, where, not just anybody gets into that business. So about a year after that, the movie Pandora's Promise happened. I got involved with this movie after I met the director, some venture capitalists and philanthropic supporters here in Palo Alto. This movie was interesting because it told the story of prominent environmentalists that ended up changing their minds on nuclear power. And that was actually, for some people, that's kind of traumatic, right? Because you hold on to something for a long time. And then revisiting that and going through the rational process of saying, I understand why I did what I did then, but knowing now what I know now, I see that that was really not the right position to take. So there were a couple of preeminent scholars and environmentalists who made a compelling argument for coming back to nuclear energy and moving forward with it. And the release of this movie was really interesting. in essence, it got the right message to the right people at the right time here in the US political center. Granted, the movie featured more senior people, but it turned out that the politicians in Washington, D.C. Had been there through many events in the movie. They were also senior, and they had a perspective that they could see what these people went through in going through this, essentially taking in all that had happened in the last 30 years and coming up with a different conclusion. In the process of using this movie as a conversation starter in Washington, D.C., we discovered that in the most senior levels of the government in the USA, nuclear was not a partisan issue. A majority of the senior government functions and politicians wanted to see something happen, and they all had different reasons for doing this. I'm not going to label who exactly in the political sphere wanted what, but if you look at everybody coming together here, the most important word is, what does nonpartisan mean? So there's partisan, which is you're fighting for politics and ideology. There's bipartisan, which means that you can get people from different parties to agree on the same thing because of some kind of compromise or joint ideal. Nonpartisan means actually not even having to explain that you're working with the opposition, because you're doing it for reasons that are consistent with your own ideology. And as many of you likely know, the politics in the US is pretty polarized. So having everybody believe that nuclear is doing the right thing for them actually removed partisan politics from the discussions. It's one of the reasons I think that nuclear policies in the US have been one of the great policy successes. We've gotten a number of bills passed. And I mean, this slide sums up things that are important to the US. Obviously, Australia is not the same, but if you think about it, what is it that the Australian Party members would want? I mean, the economic impacts on the local municipalities that would benefit, I think, are things they would share in common. The role of R&D in increasing the economy for various parts of Australia, I think, are also examples of that. Building out jobs is probably another good example. Having a reliable grid at a reasonable cost, another one. On the other hand, the US is probably different in that, being the US, it wants to have like the gold standard in nuclear regulatory policy, or it wants to set a global tone in the control of proliferation of nuclear materials. And Australia is just going to have, I think, a different take on these kind of areas of commonalities and non-partisanship. But this is something that, Australians need to figure out, frankly. And I think one of the most powerful takeaways I had when working with this is that being pro-nuclear or pro-advanced nuclear for the newer stuff was really doing the right thing for the country. You could get a lot of people rallied around that message, and it's worked pretty well for us. So here is a picture of us on one of the first meetings we had near the White House. That White House in the distance there, that's the White House. It was really interesting because this meeting brought together, I think, 150 to 200 people from all walks of the government, as well as a number of, and I mean, like departments, State Department and NSA, so on, as well as politicians. And what was neat is that these people really represented what the country worries about. So things that are important to the United States, things that are important to senators, things that are important to the State Department. And it's at a pretty high level. And these people are smart and they really care. And so it turned out that putting nuclear on the table again seemed like a good idea at that time to those people. And so that picture is of, I think, the little kernel of us that started in these discussions. That's me when I was looking a little younger. And we were able to take our authentic viewpoints, and that's very important, is to bring people to these discussions who represent the thing that you're advocating for, And we were able to bring more and more people into the fold, more capable people, smarter people, better connected. And this has turned into a number of successful pieces of legislation. Um, NEMA, the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, you can't go without terrible acronyms in Washington, um, is an example of one of the many pieces of legislation that addresses sort of patchwork, if you will, but with deliberate process, the way to get the national labs open to support companies developing nuclear, the way to get funding for some of the companies doing some advances in materials, the way to improve the regulatory process, and so on. One of the fun stories I have from this is just how well everybody is working together on this. I was in the US Capitol building when the voting was going on for one of these pieces of legislation. And at the time, major environmental organizations were constantly calling the senatorial offices, pleading them to, vote no on these nuclear support bills. But the people in politics knew what they were doing and why they were doing it. And so the senatorial offices sort of had a script of questions that they were, interacting with people on. So it's not like they were trying to shut out the critique, but they wanted the people who were providing critique to offer an alternative. And this is where the environmental organizations typically actually lost traction because they didn't have an alternative or a good response to how do we guarantee that the grid will have reliable power, or how do we address important items to the country, like if the US lets go entirely of nuclear stewardship, do we really want the other major players to set the new regulatory and safety standards? That's something to ponder. So I'd say that federal policy for nuclear has succeeded because it has many supporters, and each of those supporters have supported for many different reasons. There is a little article online. It's called How Advanced Nuclear Got on the Map. You can read a bit more there if you like and see what worked for the US. And just sort of a little diversion before I wrap this up is let's look a little bit at policy that didn't quite work. And here I will pick on California, where I live, because I can do that. So today, this was taken at noon today. So you can see that the state of California here on electricity maps looks very green. It does not look that good right now as we're speaking because it's dark. And what we see here is that solar energy is predominantly powering the grid. Of course, now that it's dark, that's not happening. So natural gas is really doing its thing right now. And that is actually a fundamental flaw in California's strategy in what it's calling an energy transition, because the grid depends on natural gas. As more and more intermittent energy has been added to California's grid, that cuts into the business case for the efficient, cleaner combined natural gas plants, or nuclear for that matter, because it takes away their revenue for so much of the day. In California today, I think there's one combined cycle plant that's still alive. All the rest of them are gas peaker plants, which, not surprisingly, are more polluting than a combined cycle plant, and they're less efficient, so they spew out more CO2 per kilowatt hour. They are, however, a very good match for solar. The problem is that, does this actually form an energy transition? And I don't think it does, because there is essentially no way to pull natural gas out of this system without completely changing the revenue models for everything else. So if you wanted to put in, like a large, well, hydro is not going to work in California. We don't have enough water here. But if you wanted to put in bring in a large nuclear backbone, you would essentially have to take revenue away from the existing solar in order to make sure that the nuclear is selling its electricity, certainly around 24 hours a day. So I think what we have in California is ideology started this transition, but they didn't really think it through. It doesn't look like there's a way to go to zero carbon in California. And so I guess that leads me to say that if you want to do policies, you need to think about where you want to end up. What are the pieces you need? And sort of magical thinking that takes you from where you are to maybe where you want to be doesn't really work. You have to have real economics, real physics, that kind of thing to make a good policy system work. So I guess I'll just wrap it up on, I don't have a prediction or a specific recommendation actually for Australia. I'm not familiar enough with the territories and the weather and so on. But I guess I just, we can see that it's a fairly carbon intensive electric system here. But it comes down to what source of electric energy does Australia really want to depend on in the long run? And why would the highest levels of Australian government care? I think if you ask questions like that and start exploring it, you will start to find your own way to get the energy future that you want. So thank you.
Brown map of Australia is really quite confronting when you see just how much our reliance on fossil fuel generated power really is. And I love that website because it shows us just how countries have some great energy mixes out there. So thank you so much. And I note that it is late for you over on the West Coast, so I appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today.